Okay, so we'll pick up where we left off last week with Job. We're starting to enter the home straight now on this one, on this book. So last week we were looking at this fourth person who comes along called Elihu. And we got to a number of things that he was saying. Now remember that Elihu isn't contradicted by God and he's not told he's wrong. And for himself, he claims to be speaking under the anointing of the Holy Spirit. So we give more weight to what he's saying than we would normally to any of the other friends for the reasons we've talked about. And where we finished off last week was chapter 33. And I'm just going to pick those up from the Message version, chapter 33, verses 8 to 12. And the point that we got to was that God is speaking. Even then, God was speaking to men and that they were able to hear him. And whilst that's surprising to us, because in the New Testament, we've all got the Holy Spirit. In the Old Testament, God spoke in different ways to men. And what Elihu is saying is that God isn't a distant, incomprehensible God in the same way as Job was describing him. And he's not random, he's actually understandable, and that he does speak to men. And what he says, now pick it up, verse 8 of chapter 33. Here's what you said, Job. I heard you say it with my own ears. You said, I'm pure, I've done nothing wrong. Believe me, I'm clean, my conscience is clear. But God's picking on me and he treats me like I'm an enemy. He's thrown me in jail and he keeps me under constant surveillance. But let me tell you, Job, you're wrong, dead wrong. God is far greater than any human. So how can you haul him into court and then complain he won't answer your charges? God always answers one way or another, even when people don't recognize his presence. So the problem is not that God isn't answering. The problem is that people weren't recognizing how he was speaking and how he was answering them. And clearly what Elihu's saying is, I'm speaking from the Holy Spirit, and I'm part of God's answer to you, Job. And what's really interesting in this is that he then goes on and he gives us some insight to how God spoke directly to people in the Old Testament. And these of course are still valid to us today, but it's really interesting how he would speak to people when they didn't all have the Spirit of God within them. And so that's verse 15 to 18. Again, I'll read it from the Message. So he says, he's basically saying this is how these are the ways God speaks to people in the Old Testament. Now, we're kind of familiar with God speaking directly through prophets, aren't we? And we've got some bit of background that God seemed to speak in visions and dreams and things, particularly when we studied Daniel, when we were looking at the end times. But this is what he's saying. God always answers one way or another, even when people don't recognize his presence. In a dream, for instance, or a vision at night, men and women are deep in sleep, fast asleep in their bed. God opens their ears and he impresses upon them warnings to turn them back from something bad that they may be planning or from reckless choices, to keep them from an early grave, from the river of no return. So it's really kind of interesting there, isn't it? What he's saying is that actually, even the Old Testament, God was actually active on an individual level, and he was warning people and trying to turn them back from going the wrong way and making the wrong choices and so on. And I'm kind of fascinated by that, because I myself have experienced this when the London bombings took place. I think most of you know this story, but that I was actually meant to be going into London that morning and would have been going through Russell Square underground station at about the time that the bombings took place. And on the way to the train station, I really felt impressed by God not to go into London that morning, but to go to the office first and then go in later. And of course, I went into the office, and then later, about the time I would have been arriving in London, that happened. So I was really interested to see that God did that in the Old Testament, that he warned people. But the problem was that people didn't recognize his presence. They didn't know his presence. And I was thinking about this, and one of the things that's obvious in the Old Testament is that people did know what God's will was, and they did seem to have some sort of ability to relate to him. Cain, for instance, has a conversation with God. Abraham clearly knew accurately what God was saying to him. And so it seems to be a more direct one-on-one communication. And so he then goes on and he says, okay, another way God talks is that, when you're in the middle of suffering, when you're in the middle of pain, then God, even at your worst moment, God can come into that moment and reason with you, argue with you, convince you of what you should be doing, and convince you how you responded. And that's verse 19 to 22. And he says, man is also chastened with pain on his bed. Now, that's kind of a challenging statement, the way that's written, because it looks like it's saying, well, God is causing the pain in order to convince man. Now, the challenge for us here is that we have a completely different covenant with God. And we know from what James says that God doesn't do things like that. God doesn't test us. He doesn't tempt us. He doesn't put sickness on us. In fact, he's the healer. And I think one of the ways that we can understand this verse is that it's got two equivalent readings. One is that God comes into the middle of our suffering and reasons with us and convinces us, and that we're never too sick and never too ill to be brought back from that point to life. And I think in part what's been said here, because we then go on and he says something really interesting. He says, verse 21, his flesh wastes away from sight, his bones stick out, which were once not seen. Yes, his soul draws near the pit, and his life to the executioners. Yet there is a messenger for him, a mediator, one among 1,000, to show man his uprightness. Then he is gracious to him and says, deliver him from going down to the pit, because, now I'll come on to this in a second, because this is just amazing. It's another one of these great revelations that comes out of Job. But what he's saying there is, even on someone's deathbed, God is speaking to them. Again, the problem is we're not recognizing his presence. And what Elihu's saying here is he's sending angels at this point. He's sending a champion. I'll read you it from the Message so you can see what's going on here. But even then, an angel could come, a champion, because there's thousands of them, to take up your cause. A messenger who would mercifully intervene, cancelling the death sentence with the words, I've come up with the ransom. Before you know it, you're healed again, a picture of health. So what's happening now? Well, what's happening here is what Job is being told, that what needs to be seen of God is available to man, even under that covenant, that time that Job was operating, because there's messengers, there's mediators, there's champions, there's angels. And for us, then Jesus is that mediator, because he's able to interpret both languages. He's able to understand what God's saying. He's able to understand what we're feeling. And he's a man like ourselves. And we looked at this before, this mediator who is able to touch both God and mankind. And what Elihu is saying is that mediator exists. That mediator you were looking for, Job, he exists. And what's more, he's got armies of angels that he can send to communicate with you. So the problem isn't that God isn't going to give you answers, and the problem isn't that he doesn't want to talk to you. The problem is, Job, that you are challenging him on the basis of your own righteousness, and you're blaming him for everything that's gone wrong in your life. And so you're not actually sensing his presence. These things are going on, but you don't know. You're not able to hear his voice. And so, that's in itself is significant. And what it's saying is that this mediator, these messengers, were actually trying to communicate with mankind to show them out to be in right standing with God. And what's interesting here is that as a result, when they receive these messengers, when people actually heard the voice of God, they received certain things. So if we just go back to those verses, there is a messenger for him, a mediator, one among 1,000, to show man his uprightness. Then he is gracious to him. So he shows man his the uprightness of God. Then he's gracious to him, says, deliver him from going down to the pit, because I found a ransom. And his flesh shall again be like a young child. He will return to the days of youth. He will pray to God, and he will delight in him. He shall see his face with joy, for he restores to man his righteousness. Then he looks at men and says that he will redeem his soul from going down to the pit, and his life shall see the light. Behold, God works all these things, twice, in fact, 3 times with the man, to bring his soul from the pit, that he may be enlightened with the light of life. What's he saying? He's saying that when we receive the messenger, when we recognize God's presence, because we recognize that righteousness is of him, and that we in ourselves aren't righteous, then God can do something. First thing he says is what? He's gracious to him. He gives grace. Remember, we're not under the law here. We're operating under covenant of grace. He gives grace. He rescues him from destruction, delivers him from going down to the pit. He's healed. He's well and feels like a young man again. And his relationship with God is restored, and they have communication. He can pray to God. And in other words, what Elihu is saying is, God isn't anything like you claimed him to be, Job. Just remember what he's responding to here, because Job said this, verse 10 and 11. You say he finds occasion against me, he counts me his enemy, he puts my feet in the stocks, and he watches all my paths. And remember, Elihu says you're just dead wrong, Job. So God's not like anything that Job had described him, or anything like the friends had described him. In fact, he's a God who was trying to communicate with men who didn't recognize his presence, didn't want his presence, didn't want to walk in his righteousness, and so were unable to receive his grace, because people like Job felt that God was he got a downer on them. He was random. You couldn't reason with him. He was distant. And he was judging us and bringing things on us because of our sin. And what Elihu is saying is God's not like that at all, not like you pictured him. He's a God of grace who rescues from destruction. He's a healer, and he's a restorer of relationships. And isn't that brilliant? Isn't that amazing? But the big thing that I think is just absolutely wonderful in here is, why does that all happen? How can Job be made right with God? There's one thing to be able to communicate with God, but there's another thing to be made right with God. So how does Job be made right with God? And the answer's in what we've read, and it's the words that I didn't read. deliberately, because he says, because I have found a ransom. I have found a payment. Charles Spurgeon said this. He said that it's this is God's eureka moment, as in, like, this is the big revelation that whilst man could never pay for anything, God has found somebody who will pay the ransom to redeem him. And this is what Spurgeon said: the most astonishing novelty under heaven is the old story of the cross of Christ. I do not think it would ever occurred to any mind but the mind of God himself to save sinners by substitutionary sacrifice. We do not pay for these things ourselves. Jesus paid for them. It's grace. For Job, God had a ransom, and Job was looking forward to that payment of ransom, because Jesus was our ransom before the foundation of the world. And so there's a consequence of this ransom being paid. And I'll go back to verses 26 to 30. He shall pray to God, and he'll delight in him. He shall see his face with joy, for he restores to man his righteousness. And in my translation, his is capitalized, so it's God's righteousness. He restores to man God's righteousness, that right standing with God that he's given and comes from God himself. Then he looks at men and says, I've sinned and perverted what was right, it did not profit me. He will redeem his. Then he looks at me. That doesn't read right, does it? Verse 27. Let me just get that from in the Message. It says, so you may fall on your knees and pray to God's delight. You'll see God smile and celebrate, finding yourself set right with God. You'll sing God's praises to everyone you meet, testifying, I messed up my life, and let me tell you, it wasn't worth it. But God stepped in and saved me from certain death. I'm alive again, and once more I see the light. So when we receive grace, when Job received this grace, what's the end result? There's a testimony of God's goodness. Job gives testimony of God's goodness. He delights in God's presence. There's the praise of his righteousness and his rescue from destruction, and we get to live in his light. It's kind of really, it just is absolutely astonishing that right at the beginning, in the earliest, probably the earliest book of the Bible, there's this enormous revelation of the cross of Christ, the redemption, the ransom that's paid, the mediator, the one who gives us righteousness as a free gift, who restores our relationship with God, gives us access to his presence so we can pray to him, so we can delight in his presence and live for the praise of his glory. It's just incredible. Let's go on to chapter 34, because we're going to hear some more things that Elihu has to say. I'll read verses, chapter 34, and I'll go to verse 10 to 15. Therefore, listen to me, you men of understanding. Far be it from God to do wickedness, and from the Almighty to commit iniquity. He repays man according to his work, and makes man to find a reward according to his way. Surely God will never do wickedness, nor will the Almighty ever pervert justice. Who gave him charge over the earth, or who appointed him over the whole earth? If he should set his heart on it, if he should gather to himself his spirit and his breath, all flesh would perish together, and man would return to dust. Now, there's two aspects of what Elihu's saying there. And again, he's telling us something. He's telling Job something about God, but he's telling us something about God. And the first one is this: God does not do evil. Remember, Job had kind of thrown that back at him and said, why is God doing all this to me? And he had this theology that basically said, everything that good's happened to me because God does it, and everything that bad's happened to me actually happens because either God does it or God permits it, and it's all God. But I won't turn against him, I won't curse him because he's God, but I recognize that he's responsible for everything in my life, and I'm just, it just all happens according to God's plan. And the trouble with that is that would require God to bring about bad things in your life as well as good things. But that is what many Christians believe. And it's a very sad theology or sad set of beliefs, but it's also a very dangerous one because it robs us entirely of faith. Because how can you ever have any faith in God as a promise-making, covenant-keeping God if he's just random and does what he wants and you've got no control or no input to anything that happens to you in your life? What's the point of praying if you can't change anything? And people come up with all sorts of convoluted ideas of what the point of praying is when God's in control of everything and God does everything. And we get things like, well, it's good to pray for lost people, even though God's already decided who's lost and who's saved, because we get the joy of sharing in finding out who the saved are. And you go, no, that just does not add up. But many Christians believe that, and many Christians are taught that. And, right here in Job, Elihu is saying God doesn't do bad things. What's more, he doesn't sin and he's just. So if God says it's sinful for us to kill, then it would also be sinful for God to take lives and kill. That's the point he's making. It's like God doesn't sin, so therefore many things that he's not doing. And what he goes on to say, and this is really kind of, it's interesting, but it's also challenging, and in a strange sort of way. How God sometimes brings things together. There's a timing aspect. Well, I'm actually going to talk about this on Sunday morning, because on Sunday morning, Peter actually talks about the topic of how God raises up and brings down the nations and the governments of the world. And what he says is that governments and rulers are designed by God to keep order in the world. And what Elihu says is that, God's at work in the world behind the scenes at the level of the rise and fall of rulers. And God's purpose in doing that, working in that realm and being involved in the world at that level, is so that we live in a world where there is order. Because there is something worse than human government, however bad it is, and that is anarchy. So God works even through the worst of rulers to keep order on the earth. That's what he's saying. Now, what he's saying in verse 16, and I'll pick this up from the Message. He says, so Job, use your head. This is all pretty obvious. Can someone who hates order, in other words, who is random and does different things at different times and so on, can someone who hates order keep order? Well, the answer by using our head is, well, no, obviously not. So if you're saying that God is random and God, acts one way one day and a different way another day, according to his whims, and he's just moving everybody around and causing good things and bad things, and without any us ever understanding it, how could God ever keep order in the world on that basis? Do you dare condemn the righteous, mighty God? Doesn't God always tell it like it is, exposing corrupt rulers as scoundrels and criminals? Does he play favourites with the rich and famous and slight the poor? Isn't he equally responsible to everybody? Now, let's go on to same chapter, verse 31 to 33. Has anyone said to God, I born chastening, I will offend no more. Teach me what I do not see. If I have done iniquity, I will do no more. Should he repay it according to your terms, just because you disavow it? You must choose and not I, therefore speak what you know. Well, what's all that about then? It's kind of a really odd way of putting things, isn't it? What it's saying is we need to go to God on his terms and not ours. That's the first thing it's saying. We need to go to God on his terms and not ours. So we don't come on the basis of our terms based on us being good, but knowing we do wrong. Because compared to God, no one is righteous. So however good we are, everybody knows to do some wrong. But what this is saying is, however good you are, you don't come on the terms of your goodness. Because compared to God, you're not good at all. So you have to come on his terms. So how do you come to God on his terms? You come in humility. Completely open about who you really are, your shortcomings, your needs, your relationship with him, everything like that. Wanting to be taught by God and receive fresh understanding. In a way, he's still talking about what the problems are with us actually hearing from God, because if we don't come with humility, wanting to be taught by God and receive fresh understanding, then we won't be able to receive from God because we're coming on our terms. In other words, I'm not bothered. I don't need to know. I'm getting along fine without you, God. I've got it all nailed. When we come on our terms and think like that, we can't hear God. That's what he's saying, because we've come on our terms and not God's. It's a bit of a little complex passage. It takes quite a while of working that out. Now, the next thing that Elihu's going to say, and all of this is kind of full of wisdom, he's going to tell us that when we do what Job did, which is no matter how bad stuff gets in our life, when we rail against God, when we blame God, when we basically say, I've had it with you, God, you know, this isn't what I bought into, nothing's going right, I don't want to know about all that Christianity stuff. What we can learn from this is when we rail against God, basically we've lost sight of who we are and we've lost sight of who he is. When we judge him by our own righteousness and blame him for bad things, what this is telling us is we don't know him. We don't know him at all. And that's really interesting. So if I just pick that up in the message and show you, chapter 36, I told you I was going through stuff like big chunks tonight. Chapter 36, verses 16 to 21. Job, don't you see at all how God's wooing you from the jaws of danger? How he's drawing you into wide open places, inviting you to feast at a table laden with blessings. And here you are, laden with the guilt of the wicked, obsessed with putting blame on God. Don't let your great riches mislead you. Don't think you can bribe your way out of this. Did you plan to buy your way out of this? Not on your life. And don't think that night, when people sleep off their troubles, will bring you any relief. Above all, don't make things worse with more evil. That's what's behind your suffering as it is. Let me just kind of explain that a bit. When we blame God for injustice, or the bad things in our lives, what we've done is we've forgotten the evidence to the contrary. So Elihu is and this is kind of where I'm going to finish tonight, because it's such an important point, because it still applies to us. So maybe we're just a little bit shorter tonight, because I want to leave next week to look at God's response to Job. But there's a really important principle that he's going to make here. And the important principle he's going to make is, it's obvious to everybody that God is good. Everybody on planet Earth, the evidence is there to see God is good. So when we go about blaming him for injustice or blaming for bad things in our life, we've actually forgotten the evidence that is all around us. And this is really, really profound. Because where is that evidence that he's talking about? He gives us the answer. The evidence is the creation that God has made for us. And what he goes on to say is, it's our failure to appreciate that, our lack of thankfulness for the good world, the good things that God has provided for us in his creation, our lack of being able to see God's goodness around him, causes and makes it impossible for us to have the relationship with him that God desires, and for us to see his goodness. So what's he saying? Well, let's just look at verses 22 to 33. Behold, God is exalted by his power. Who teaches like him? Who has assigned him his way? Or who has said, you have done wrong? That's like, who's accusing him of that? Remember to magnify his work, of which men have sung. Everyone has seen it. Man can see it from afar. Behold, God is great, and we do not know him. Nor can the number of his years be discovered, for he draws up the drops of water which distill as rain from the mist, which the clouds drop down and pour abundantly on man. So obviously, Job had a revelation there of stuff that I guess we discover much later in history, of the convection stream, of water and rain and evaporation and beforming clouds and all the rest of it. It's quite amazing, isn't it? Can anyone understand the spreading of clouds, the thunder from his canopy? Look, he scatters his light upon it and covers the depths of the sea. For by these he judges the peoples, he gives food in abundance, he covers his hands with lightning and commands it to strike. His thunder declares it, the cattle also, concerning the rising storm. At this also my heart trembles and leaps from his place. He's saying, Job, if you had looked at the world around you and the things that God has put there, which are beyond our comprehension, the majesty of creation, the lightning, the rain, the clouds, the storms, everything that you experience about this magnificence of creation, it shows us the magnificence of God. And Job, if you realized that God has placed you in that creation, the response you would have would be thankfulness and not blame. It's because you've ignored the evidence around you that you have this problem. That you think God's to blame and he isn't. Because you only have to look around you and realize that it's not him. Because he's a good God and he's made all this for you. Now, the first thing I want to say about that is that revelation that he's just done, and this he's talking about, is setting the scene for God to come on the scene. Because the next thing that's going to happen is God's going to appear and he's going to talk to Job. And God is going to talk to Job on the basis of the creation. Because God is going to say, this is what I have done. And I have done this for you. This is who I am. I'm a good God who provides righteousness for you through the ransom and the redemption. I'm a good God. And if you saw all this, you should have realized I was a good God. And at the end of that, Job's going to turn around and said, I'd heard so much about you, God, but now my eyes have seen, now I understand. That's why this is kind of a big thing, and it's really easy to miss it if you're just reading it when he's talking about thunder and lightning here. Oh yeah, get on to the next bit, get on to the next bit, get on to the next bit. But this is just so important. You see, when we see what is around us, we can begin to see who is behind it. When we see what is around us, we can begin to see who is behind it. Now, let me just expand that for you, because I believe this is kind of the problem that we face in our generation in this world. What do I mean by that? Well, let me first off give you Paul's take on this point. Let's go to Romans chapter 1. Romans chapter 1, verse 18. For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who suppress the truth in unrighteousness. Now, just read that carefully. The unrighteousness of men, and these unrighteous men suppress the truth in unrighteousness. So that people who do not want to actually acknowledge God are suppressing the truth about God. They know inside themselves that what they are saying is wrong. And yet they have determined they will not follow God, so they suppress the truth so that others can't find it, and so that they agree with them and they champion them and they go along with them. Why is that important? Well, in a world of atheists and atheist reasoning, that's really important, because that's what's happening. That's the dynamic of the situation. I don't really have time to go into it on this, but if you there's kind of a session on this passage that is in the Grace Changes Everything series that you've been listening to in the dailies in the morning. And there's obviously longer teachings on that are available with all the kind of study materials and everything to go with it. But basically what we're dealing with here is that the reason that the world is in the state it's in is because men haven't seen the goodness of God displayed in creation. And the reason they haven't seen the goodness of God displayed in creation is because man, in unrighteousness, has suppressed the truth in that unrighteousness. What should be obvious to everybody, there's a big smoke screen that is taking away that obviousness that there is a God from creation. So he's revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteous men who suppress the truth in unrighteousness. because what may be known of God is manifest in them, for God's shown it to them already. For since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so that man is without excuse. Because although they knew God, they chose not to glorify him as God, nor were they thankful, but they became futile in their thoughts, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Professing to be wise, they became fools, and they changed the glory of the incorruptible God into an image made like corruptible man, and birds, and four-footed animals, and creeping things. Therefore God's given up to the uncleanness in the lust of the heart to dishonour their bodies amongst themselves, who exchanged the truth of God for the lie, and worshipped and served the creature rather than the Creator, who is blessed forever. Amen. And Elihu is saying that was the problem, why people weren't hearing God, why they weren't recognizing God, why they were blaming God for things, why they misunderstood who God is. And right now in our generation, we have that problem magnified. This is so true of who we are, because man has attempted to remove the glory of creation and make it a product of random mechanical interactions. And that's what the evolutionists believe, that's what the atheists believe, that everything around us is just a product of random mechanical interactions. Why is that so much a plan of the enemy? Because if you can get mankind to believe that this is just a random series of mechanical interactions, all by chance, then you remove the display of the glory of God from the eyes of man that leads mankind to God. That's why it's such a big thing. It's such a big thing that we understand what is taking place here. And it was a big thing even in Job's time, because it was Job's failure to recognize the goodness of creation around him, and his friends to recognize that goodness, that had got him to the point of blaming God, and this worldview that they held, that they were just pawns and God just did good things and bad things and all the rest of it. Why? Because they didn't see the evidence to the contrary in creation. And it's just so important. Let me just finish off on that, because picking up at verse 19, so I'm just working out, I'm just trying to remember which chapter I got to. Chapter 36, verse 19. Will your riches or all the mighty forces keep you from distress? Do not desire the night when people are cut off in their place. Take heed, do not turn to iniquity, for you have chosen this rather than affliction. Behold, God is exalted by his power. Who can teach like him? Who has assigned him his way? Or who has said you have done wrong? Who's accused him of that? Remember to magnify his work, of which men have sung. Everyone has seen it. Man looks on it from afar. Behold, God is great, and we do not know him, nor can number of his years be discovered. For he draws up drops of water, etc., which distill the rain. And it talks all about this creation. Now, if I just pick that up from the Message, particularly verse 14 to 18, I think it puts it really well. Job, 16. I'll go from 16. Job, don't you see how God's wooing you from the jaws of danger? He's drawing you into wide open places, inviting you to a feast at a table laden with blessings. Here you are laden with the guilt of the wicked. In other words, you're listening to all this stuff, obsessed with putting the blame on God. Don't let your riches mislead you, and so on. And then on to verse 22. Do you have any idea at all how powerful God is? Have you ever heard of a teacher like him? Has anyone ever had to tell him what to do or correct him, saying, you did that all wrong? Well, obviously, it's a rhetorical question. No. Remember then to praise his workmanship, which is so often celebrated in song. Everybody sees it. Nobody is too far away to see it. So take a long, hard look. See how great he is, infinite, greater than anything you could ever imagine or figure out. Pulling the water out of the sea, distilling it, filling up the rain cloud cisterns, then the skies open and pour out soaking showers on everyone. Does anyone have the slightest idea how this happens or how to do it? How he arranges the clouds, how he speaks in thunder. Look at the lightning, his sky filling light show, illumining the dark depths of the sea. These are the symbols of his sovereignty, his generosity, his loving care. He hurls arrows of light, taking sure and accurate aim, and the high God roars in thunder, his anger against evil. It is so key that we see the beauty and goodness of creation around us. Because that is the thing, that is the great display of evidence that God has given us of his beauty and his goodness and his power and his glory. And when people suppress that truth and they try to rob mankind of seeing that, they are robbing us of our ability to see the glory and beauty of God. And we replace it with the creature, the molecule, the random interaction, the theory, and so on. And so what was Job's problem, or one of Job's problems, is also the problem that we have to face up to. And what's the response? The response is to encourage us to look at the glory of creation and celebrate God in it and be thankful for it and just rejoice in it. You know, the response that I have to this and seeing this is just, I went out in my garden and I just started looking at the flowers and I started looking at the sky and I started looking at all these amazing things around us. And we've got little snowdrops in our garden and little yellow things coming. We've got all sorts of life that is coming, and it's all God. And he's not put that there for his enjoyment. He's put that there for us, so we can see how much he loves us. Amen.